Maybe
Well, I
just
think
pick
a lot
up
of
the
it is
phone.
that still, where are we at? 20 years into social media now, people haven't worked out what it's for. People haven't worked out whether it is chatting to your mates down the pub or whether it is, as it legally is, actually publishing stuff which can be seen by other people.
Yeah.
If you were organising something in the old days through setting up a newsletter or something and sending out to people and saying, let's have a ruck down at the Millwall ground, out of thin air, other football clubs are available, then you would expect the police to take an interest in that. If you're doing that on Facebook or just on Twitter off your own bat, then it's out there, it's public. People are going to take an interest in that. People are going to react to that, whether they agree with you or very much virulently disagree with you or think it's illegal.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into a wider question about, which is a free speech question, about how much should the social networks be responsible for the riot-encouraging slop that they allow, and they have just taken a view that it's absolutely nothing to do with them. They're just platforms in a way which you, as editor of this magazine, simply wouldn't be able to do. Just hold your heads up and go, well, some contributor put something in at the last minute. I can't be held responsible.
Well, that's pretty much how they did it in The Spectator, didn't it, with Taki for many, many years. Whenever he wrote a racist column, they just go, well, I'm only the editor, I can't tell him what to write.
I can't tell him not to write in praise
It's
of
never
the
quite been
Fairmont.
your approach, has it, Ian?
No. And I do agree with Helen. The idea that you just put on one of your platforms something that is not only manifestly untrue, but is likely to stoke up a riot straight away, shortly after you've just had some real riots, I mean, it seems to be reasonable to expect people to take some care with that.
What we really need to talk about, though, is the fact that Adam is ringing his shame bell.
Yes.
Inaudibly. It's a very high-pitched shame bell, so only younger listeners will be able to hear it.
Whistle. That's what it is.
We come to the bit of the podcast, just like on page 2 of a newspaper.
Corrections and clarifications.
Exactly.
I wish to apologise. In a previous episode of Page 94 of the Private Eye Podcast, specifically our questions and answers to listeners one, I think it was last February, wasn't it? We talked about, amongst other things, super injunctions. And I said very, very clearly, as far as I know, they are a thing of the past, and I'm pretty certain about this. Listeners, I was wrong. As you will know by now, there was one very, very spectacular and long-standing super injunction which was awarded to the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, back in August 2023. It was massive headline news over the last few weeks. To summarise it, basically, it was about the leak of a list of names of Afghan people who were being considered for resettlement after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. The MOD didn't actually realise the list had been put out there by accident for another 18 months. So it was August 2023 when they went for not a super injunction, simply an injunction that would cover the kind of security of these people while they worked out what to do about it, because obviously these people were in danger of reprisals by the Taliban. It then went on for months and months and years after that, and has finally only been dropped after a review brought in by the incoming Labour government, which said it was not necessary and not needed anymore. In that meantime, it has covered, this is the extraordinary bit, the relocation of 20,000 or more people, which we weren't told about, which obviously, migration into this country being quite a hot political topic for the last few years, it does seem rather relevant. And as the judge noted in the final judgment, there's billions of pounds of taxpayers' cash being spent on this as well, with no oversight from either the public or, more to the point, from Parliament. So, it was quite a biggie, really.
This was an MOD list.
It was within the MOD. It was about the people who needed resettling from Afghanistan because of the work they had done with British troops out there. So it's people like translators and facilitators and drivers and all that kind of thing.
Was there not a suggestion too that some of them had put as their references names of serving army officers, potentially serving intelligence officers as well?
There were, it turned out, in a slightly separate legal action, the names of certain MI6 officers and Special Forces soldiers also revealed in the league.
And it was a super injunction used for what they were traditionally used for, which was to cover up what had happened and make sure no one took any blame.
Well, it was a really odd one because initially you could see the argument for keeping this stuff secret. And in fact, the media organisations that initially approached the MOD, which was actually Lewis Goodall at the Newsagents podcast, and Independent were involved at quite an early stage as well because they'd heard about this leak. They said, look, we understand that there are security implications. Journalists generally, this may surprise listeners, but we don't want to get people killed. It's really not what we came into the game for the most part. And they were willing to hold back on that stuff. And it was, in fact, the judge, a man called Mr. Justice Robin Knowles, who, interestingly, is not from the media list, he's from the financial list. This is a case, you'll remember this, Ian, going back to the days when super injunctions and injunctions were being cast all over the place. It tended to be the judge who was on duty and was called out in his pyjamas and didn't really know what area he was talking about and would just say, well, why don't you have one of these then? That's exactly what happened in this case. No one was going for a super injunction. It was Mr. Justice Knowles who came up with it and said, well, why don't you have one of these? So arguments to be made. As I say, the journalists were quite happy to keep the stuff secret. And there are precedents for this. Do you remember 2008, Prince Harry, when he was deployed to Afghanistan? There was no kind of formal system to keep that a secret while he was over there. It was sort of gentlemen's agreement, gentlewomen's agreement, I guess, across the press, that they would keep that a secret. And it was only blown by the Drudge Report, which is a pretty down market kind of American website that blew the whole thing open in that case. So it could have worked that way. We're in a slightly more feral world now, as we've been saying, with social media. But actually, the list was leaked partially on Facebook by someone in Afghanistan. And actually, because of the feral world of social media, as far as I can see, there was no way of imposing the super injunction on him. And the only actual thing that happened as a result of that was that he got his own resettlement expedited as a result. Which sounds a little bit like blackmail, which is one of the other things that used to get thrown around in the cases of
That's
super
outrageous. I'm voting reform.
But as the joke pages had it, normally these super injunctions were to cover incidents where celebrities were getting screwed, as opposed to the entire country for billions of pounds.
It does seem slightly more important than what Harold Donald from Take That was doing with his Winky, doesn't it?
Good Lord.
Not only do I know what you're referring to,
But I wish I didn't.
In fact, it was actually discharged, this super injunction, in July 2024, and then promptly reinstated by the Court of Appeal. They were on the media side of it, and there were a lot of media organisations involved by that point in the legal action, thought that's it, we're there, and then the MOD appealed it. It went back to the Court of Appeal and has been subject to various more hearings until this point.
but it also meant that a number of commentators found their heads exploding because they had to move from why can't we stand by our Afghan allies into what are we doing having another 24,000 people flying in here without any checks. So it had follow-up effects as well.
Right.
And it covered the period, of course, in the run-up to the general election as well, when, unchecked migration was an enormous issue. So, it was a hell of a political hot potato that was being covered up.
I found it quite cheering. I mean, we actually managed to organise all of that repatriation for people without anyone finding out. I was a level of British state capacity I didn't know we possessed.
You're right.
Yeah, if we could apply that same zeal to like building some houses or something, and how wonderful that would be.
Okay, but in many ways, what I'm hearing, a win for Britain. Right, that's it for this episode of Page 94. We'll be back again in a fortnight with another one. My thanks to Ian, Helen, Adam, and of course to John Farley. Thank you to you for listening. If you would like more examples of untrammeled free speech, which nonetheless maintains the boundaries of usually taste and decency while still being very funny, then why not buy a copy of Private Eye? Go to private-eye.co.uk. You can get a year's subscription to Private Eye for the cost of, I would say, about 6 coffees. So that's worth doing.
Plus unlimited placards to print out and take to your next protest. I'm taking a Thrib poem along to my next one, whether it's relevant or not.
You'll be arrested for the scansion. So thank you very much again to all of you for listening, and to Ollie Peart of Rethink Audio for producing. Bye for now.
Okay, here we are in the Origins podcast. Okay, here we are in the Origins podcast for one of my favorite times every month, when I get to speak to one of my favorite people, Sabine Hossenfelder, and I get to hear her unique take on science, and we have a discussion of science topics in the news, what's new in science, and it's something I've come to really enjoy, and I'm really happy to say, as far as I can tell, other people actually enjoy it too. So Sabina, how are you doing there in Europe? Is it hot?
Today's fine. It's actually raining outside, so yeah. Well, good to see you, and good to see you in a studio this time.
Yeah, that's right. I try, following you, I try and up the game a little bit because you're always so professional. So it's nice to be in a studio. Thank you. Well, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of interesting cosmic and terrestrial topics today. And speaking of terrestrial, you're going to talk about a topic that's supposedly going to change the future of the world. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I want to talk about hydrogen. So this is a topic I've followed for a long time because I have a personal grudge with the German government that's invested a lot into this so-called hydrogen economy that isn't going anywhere. So I have a lot of misgivings about this stuff because I've always said, like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, to begin with, the idea that we would produce hydrogen from renewable energy and then use that to, create electricity. It's terribly energy inefficient, so it doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
And so in practical terms, what actually happened is that we're paying taxes for what's being called the hydrogen-ready power plants. Well, what are they? They're actually just gas power plants, because once you have something that can deal with methane, that has a lot of leaches in it, it's not that difficult to switch it to burning hydrogen. So, and hydrogen has a lot of problems that I don't want to go through the whole list, but besides the energy efficiency, I think that the next biggest problem might be what's been called hydrogen embrittlement. Like, whenever you want to store the stuff or you want to push it through pipes, you have this issue that hydrogen is the smallest of all atoms. And so it creeps into everything and destroys the material sooner or later. So I think that this is going to become a maintenance nightmare, which is also going to drive up the cost.
Let me interrupt for 1 second, just because we know, just so people know, you might, in light of the things you said already, people might say, why hydrogen at all? But the whole point initially is hydrogen burns with oxygen to form water and releases energy, and therefore there's no carbon dioxide, there's no bad byproducts. That's why there's no fossil fuel carbon byproducts, and that causes the initial excitement about hydrogen and why there's so much verbiage. And I'll also say I used to speak out against it because in the old days, when I did, people didn't realize that, it sounds great, except you get the hydrogen from fossil fuels, so you end up, in the old days, it was a scam because you didn't save any carbon or anything to get the hydrogen. But things have changed. So anyway, just to preface where you're at, go on.
Yeah, that's right. At the moment, we get almost all the hydrogen actually from methane or coal in some cases, because there are all these H's in there. But if you have methane, that's CH4, you also have the carbon. And so if you split off the hydrogen, you're left with carbon dioxide, which is exactly what you don't want. And so this is why that's the idea. We produce it from renewables, like from solar or wind or something, and that just isn't happening. And even if we would manage to get it done, it'd be ridiculously expensive. So I doubt it'll ever make sense. Nevertheless, the German government and also the many European countries and also the United States, by the way, have put a lot of money into this so-called hydrogen economy. So there's one possibility to make sense of this, which is if we were to find naturally occurring reservoirs of hydrogen. This has been called white hydrogen, not actually referring to the color of the stuff, but just they have a color scale that tells you where the stuff comes from. And so this white hydrogen is something that you can find in the ground in some places, like natural gas, like methane. And so it gets stuck in like porous rocks, and then you can drill into it. And I actually don't know exactly how it works, but they get it out of the ground and they can use it. And so the issue is just that so far there's been only one place where they actually do this, which I think is in Mali or somewhere. So it exists, but it's been believed to be really rare. And then like 2 years ago, there was a group of French researchers that claimed they'd found a reservoir of white hydrogen actually pretty close to the border to Germany. And just like 2 months ago, they claimed they'd found a second one a little bit further north. So big if true. Like, so we haven't actually seen them extract anything from the ground. And then the other thing that happened was a group of geologists went and tried to generally analyze like the possible abundance of the stuff in the ground based on what we know about how those rocks formed. There are different ways that hydrogen could be formed underground. For example, because water comes into contact with some very hot stones that contain certain minerals, and so it gets split into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen then embeds in the stone, or it could happen through radioactive decay and some other possibilities. And they just produced this global map where they said, look, in these places it's possible that you can find something, and they estimate that all these hydrogen reserves combined could power the world for 100,000 years. This is why I say big if true, right? So, of course, just because you put it on a map doesn't mean you can actually extract it. So there are lots of ifs and thens there. But honestly, to me, it was like, I got this feeling like we might have underestimated, if not, with an actual mathematical estimate, but unconsciously, how much of this stuff might already be lying around. So if it was true, and we could just, even if it's just a fraction of this, I mean, if it lasts for 100 years or something, that would be a really big deal. And there are a lot of startups. I mean, saying a lot is maybe saying too much, but a couple of startups we're trying to look into this and are actually trying to extract this white hydrogen. So I think that's a very interesting development.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I learned about it from you, and I was looking at that paper you mentioned it a little bit, and I was intrigued because it does make sense. Many years ago when I was I first proposed we look for antineutrinos from the Earth to do geophysics, and now people do it, but this was 40 years ago. There are lots of interesting processes, radioactive processes, but other processes. And let's face it, there's lots of, when I think about deep ocean vents, what comes out of there is hydrogen sulfide. There's lots of hydrogen coming out of those vents. So when you think about, when I saw that, I thought, it makes sense. There probably is a lot of hydrogen that may come out. And, but as you point out, it's a long way from maybe having it to making it practical and useful. But it does at least, it made me feel a little bad because I used to make so much fun of the hydrogen people by saying, first you get gasoline, then you burn it to get hydrogen, and then you use your free clean hydrogen. It was just, it seemed like a scam. Plus it's a little bit dangerous to transport, but as you said, also it's very invasive. But one thing that did occur to me, I do want to ask you this, you sort of mentioned it as a negative, but if we had so much hydrogen we didn't know what to do with it, then if you had something like fission or obviously you had fusion, it'd be different, but even fission, something that, the problem with fission plants and fusion plants is you produce electricity, which is not a problem, but it's nice. But you do sometimes, until everyone has electric cars, you don't necessarily use electricity. And if you had hydrogen and combined with oxygen, you would be able to power as fuel cars. And so it occurred to me that maybe if we had a lot of some kind of renewable or carbon-free power source, then splitting hydrogen and oxygen from seawater, which is very energy intensive, if we had a surplus of energy, it might not be completely crazy because not all forms of energy we need are in the form of electricity. You may want to have fuel. And we don't have these grids that allow you to move electricity and batteries that allow you to store it. So if you could convert what would otherwise be electricity to hydrogen that you could use as fuel locally in your car or in a power plant, it might not be so crazy. I was thinking about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's totally correct. In the end, I think it'll come down to how expensive is it. But like this is the most practical application of hydrogen that people have thought of. You could use it for transportation, for example, in big trucks or something, because you know these hydrogen tanks are kind of heavy. So for for standard passenger cars, it's maybe not so great. I mean, they do exist, but they have some downsides. But if you have a big truck that weighs some tons already, it doesn't really matter, basically. And the other thing is that you could use it to store energy. So this is one of those things where, for example, in Germany, there was supposed to be a project where they had these offshore wind turbines that were supposed to produce hydrogen, and they wanted to pump this through some pipes to somewhere on land. And so if you have a surplus of energy from there, you can store it in the hydrogen, and then you can use it when the wind doesn't blow. Basically, that was the idea. I'm not sure what happened to this. The issue with all these things is that they're too expensive, and so especially in Germany, like we have all that coal, like, and then it's dirt cheap. So why don't we just dig up some more coal? So it becomes a big political problem.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem. I mean, that was always by the way, my concern about fission. I have no problem. I don't have any safety concerns about nuclear reactors, well-designed nuclear reactors. But given all the regulations and everything else, they're just damn expensive compared to certain things. And so it was an economic question for me as much as anything else. But the idea of storing it until we have good batteries or a better infrastructure nationwide to transport electricity, if you transport it as hydrogen and then turn it into electricity here where it might work. On the other hand, if I saw a truck that said hydrogen, and I think I've seen them, I tend to try and steer clear of them. Having been remembering the Zeppelin episodes from the old days, it is kind of flammable. Anyway, okay, so much for terrestrial hydrogen. In a sense, I want to move now to the cosmic hydrogen, which is one of the things. And cosmic hydrogen exists mostly in the form of stars, or a lot of stars and galaxies. And it leads me to the news of the month, which I think is probably the biggest story I heard reported among the news of the month was the opening up of the Vera C. Rubin telescope in Chile, which is named after a lovely woman. I knew Vera Rubin, and her story is poignant. As a young woman scientist, had a hard time to be a young woman scientist, but she never harped on that, and she did her work. And Vera Rubin was one of the first people, not the only one. She tends to get most of the credit now, but not the only one. To first argue that there was dark matter in our galaxy by looking at the rotation curves of our galaxy and other galaxies, looking at hydrogen lines and hydrogen gas clouds, and making an argument which at the time many people didn't believe, that our galaxy was rotating too fast, and now we see most other galaxies are. And you and I have different views of what might be the cause of that. But anyway, I'm very happy it's named after her. She's a lovely woman and a really good scientist. But it's a telescope in Chile, 8.4 meter telescope, which is pretty big. And first of all, it's nice to see a new telescope being built. Living in a country, I don't live in the United States, but living next to a country which can't seem to build a big telescope because it might offend some deity of some weird indigenous group that have land on it. And the 30-meter telescope is now a dead project, probably in the United States. The company wants to kill it anyway. It's nice to see a new telescope being built. And it's a very different type of telescope. It got a lot of press because it produced some pretty pictures, which is generally what telescopes do for people on the ground. That's what people like about them, is the pretty pictures. It's not really designed to produce these pretty pictures. It's designed to scan the entire southern sky every day, every 2 or 3 days, for the next 10 years to make what, if you were to look at it, might look like one of those most boring 10-year-long movies you could imagine. But if you're a scientist, it could be interesting. The idea is that it's got this incredibly big field of view. It's essentially 45 moons worth of the sky at any one time, as opposed to the James Webb Space Telescope, which has also got a pretty big field of view, but it's like 1 moon. So, and it moves faster than any other terrestrial telescope without jittering, and therefore it can see the entire sky every 3 nights. And it has the largest camera in the world, a car-sized camera, 3.2 gigapixel camera, which which is always amazing me to think about, because I know in 10 years you and our iPhones will have 3.2 gigapixel cameras, but right now a 3.2 gigapixel camera is it's almost 100 times bigger than the camera in your iPhone. It produces a single image that would, in order to see it adequately, require 400 Ultra HD TVs. And each image, each night, it produces 20 terabytes of data, which is more than the information in all the world's books. And so it sounds great. And because it's fast moving, you can see things. But because it has such a big field of view and it looks night after night after night, it can look for transient events all over the sky. And it's already, in the data they released was only the first 10 hours, which already allowed them to see 10 million galaxies, but also discover all these asteroids, because they can actually see them moving in the system. And so it sounds great, and I'm sure it will be great. And it's touted to do many things. Of course, like, it's almost a de rigueur, it's almost required constitutionally for every one of these telescopes to say that they're going to learn about dark matter and dark energy as a result. And I think you and I are more skeptical sometimes. I think it'll actually, to be fair, because it has such a big field of view, it'll look at something called gravitational lensing. It'll be able to see lensing very, very well. And that at least does map the gravity of field of galaxies. So maybe it'll reveal stuff about dark matter. I'm still not convinced about dark energy. But it actually may be most useful for saving our lives in the long run, because it's going to discover thousands of new asteroids, some of which may be on a trajectory on Earth, an Earth crossing trajectory, and maybe give us enough time to save ourselves one way or another. But I don't want to make too much light of it, because it is a new window on the universe that particularly is good for seeing a lot of things at once, and transient events, supernovae, pulsating stars, and it may be useful in integrating with gravitational wave detectors, because it's going to be able to look in real time, very fast, for odd signals. So when a gravitational wave detector sees two neutron stars collide, the gravitational wave, it might be able to tell the telescope quickly where to move, and since it's such a big field of view, even if you can't localize it very well, this telescope might see it. So it's gonna improve astronomy, and I suspect what it will discover are things we don't expect, because every time they open a new window on the universe, you're surprised. And the usual suspects like dark matter and dark energy, I expect won't be changed revolutionarily by it. But it's really exciting to have a nice new telescope that does something very, very different with neat new technology, especially if you like neat technology. So, and it has produced a few pictures, for all I know, there's going to be some nerds out there in Germany who buy themselves 400 HD TVs, put them up on a big screen, and see a picture from the moving telescope someday. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you've said almost everything. I've thought very hard about what I could possibly add. So I have one thing to add, which is that they put out an app, which is called the Sky Viewer app, that allows you to, so I don't know if that'll go through, so you can zoom in your high definition picture. And I think they plan to add some annotations, more details about what's going on in these pictures, like
You already have
what
the
I'm
app. I didn't even
looking at.
download it.
Zone advantage.
It's so
And
much
actually,
younger.
I think it opens in the browser. So like skyviewer.app. Well, I think that's just a website.
Oh, I see.
In any case, so I mean, you kind
I
of
need a hunter
said this
like
a little
you
bit
with the red
dismissively, like
jack.
it puts out pretty pictures.
Yes.
But you know, I think this is kind of really important for science communication. Like you have something to show. Something that people can relate to, and people just really like these images. I don't see anything wrong with it.
I think it is. Even if it excites kids to study science in school, it's great. I mean,
Zone
exactly,
C lost.
exactly. So I think it's great
Enemy
they put
claims
out something
Zone
like this.
C.
I hope they'll make a
Zone
little
B
bit more
lost.
of it.
You
Like
captured
this
Zone A.
seems to be
You're
just the,
almost
the
there.
core of an idea, and so, where
Enemy
there's more
claims
to
Zone
come.
B.
and and if they did something like that, I have always mixed feelings, but it's not bad. There's citizen science too. So if they have an app and they've got these huge images, they can encourage people to look in the images for things that they. I mean, I'm sure their data analysis and their AI, mechanisms are good, but you never know. If you allow a few hundred thousand people to look at these images and look in them, maybe people will see fun things that other people can't. So, yeah, I think it's wonderful, and it does illustrate a few things. I mean, space telescopes are very important, and I'm very sad
Zone C
that
captured.
the
Zone
next large space
advantage
telescope, the
yours.
Roman Space Telescope,
Enemy
was
claims
essentially
Zone
built
A.
and paid for, may not fly because the Trump administration has decided science is bad. No science. No science makes the world a better place. This is apparently what the Trump administration decided. Because
1
scientists
minute.
are bad.
You
Because
have
scientists are bad because many of them are liberal, therefore science is bad, therefore kill all the projects that have already been done. But anyway, that's a little button. But the next space telescope may not fly because at least the current administration doesn't want to budget money for it. But it's lovely when you can see how much you can do on Earth with new telescopes, and they're expensive. This one was actually less
Zone
expensive
C
than I thought. It was under $1 billion. I think it was $800 million.
30 seconds stand between
The,
you
uh,
and victory.
The
Enemy claims
next
Zone
large
C.
telescope, I think the
Zone
Magellan,
A
I think it's
captured.
called the Large Magellan Telescope. Anyway, it's probably more like $5 to $10 billion, but which is a scale. This is 8.4 meters. The larger telescopes are tens of meters across, like this, 15 to 20 meters across,
You fight
and
like
they're
a
credible.
demon for these
And
zones.
I'm
Bring
still
me your
amazed.
friends. I need more
I had a
like you.
telescope when I was a kid. I still have a telescope. I never do anything really great with it, but it amazes me that here on Earth you can look through the atmosphere and see all of that. That it's all out there. It's just it is and so inspiring. Anyway, yeah. So if it does nothing other than inspire young people to get interested in the universe, then I'm all in favor of it. But it'll
Who
do more.
knows? Maybe we'll finally discover extraterrestrial life.
Yeah, well, it's certainly there for transient phenomena one way or another. My friend Jeff Marcy and his colleagues are big on saying that the best way to look for SETI is not radio waves, but to look for optical transients. And maybe this will allow us to do that. There's certainly going to be a lot of data, 20 terabytes a night. I wouldn't want to be the data that the person who's in charge of that data set. It's amazing. Well, from the immediate and
Proceed.
in front of your face science to the esoteric science at the limits of knowledge, literally and metaphorically, I'm told that you have a very interesting paper that you read.
Yeah. And so one of the authors of the paper is also very in your face. You put out a paper together with some co-authors that argues that a theory of everything isn't logically possible. So that's my brief summary, quoting some mathematical theorems. And I want to back up a little and explain in which sense you use the phrase theory of everything, because there are several different things that this could mean. So in the narrowest sense of the word, physicists talk of the theory of everything as something that unifies all the four known fundamental forces. So the three forces in the Standard Model, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear force, and gravity. And that, in principle, should explain everything, hence the name. So in practice, of course, it's not going to, allow us to predict human behavior or something like this, because even though people are made of particles that are determined by those fundamental forces and the interaction between the particles and everything. We can't actually calculate something as complicated as that. But in principle, it'd be a theory of everything we know. And of course, physicists hope that it'd also include dark energy and dark matter, and that might not pan out. I think that in your paper you use the word in a somewhat more general sense, which isn't just that it needs to combine these four forces, but is actually also a final theory, which I think a lot of physicists believe and certainly hope, which was maybe best captured in Steven Weinberg's famous book Dreams of Final Theory. There's this idea that we're pretty close to the end of physics in some sense, because the only thing that's missing is this unification of all the forces. And yeah, that sounds very similar to what
we won't take any
Lord
unnecessary
Kelvin
risks.
said like 150 years ago, which I paraphrase, we're almost done with physics, just some little nitty left to sort out.
Extra decimal points.
Or
Yeah.
quantum mechanics and the entire statement project, right? So I don't really believe the stuff with the final theory. So this is why I read your paper, because it plays to my confirmation bias. So basically, in a nutshell, I think the argument has like three different parts. The first is the Gödel's theorem, that I think most people have already heard about, which roughly speaking says that any such theory, if you can write it down in a numeral fulfill, but I think for those are actually fulfilled for the theories that we use in practice. Then that theory will have statements that are true, but that we can't prove to be true. So that's a little bit awkward, if you want to give answers to everything, because it's a theory of everything, then actually you can prove that's not possible. And then the second argument is, it's kind of related to this, but it builds on a different theorem that says, well, for any such theory, you can't even construct a function that'll tell you what is true and what isn't true. And then the third step is a complexity bound. So whatever theory you have, there's a limit to the complexity of statements that you can make, roughly speaking, and you can't tell exactly where it is. So you don't even know, and that's a little bit awkward, because it could be that nature is just above that line. So what kind of theory of everything is actually can't explain everything which is above. So I think that's a very interesting argument, and honestly, I think that this is kind of an approach to the mathematics that we do, that I think physicists should use more often. Like so there's strictly logical argumentation about what's even theoretically possible, where are the limits of our methods. That said, I'm not so sure that it's in the end relevant, for one thing, because I don't actually believe that the final theory. I already said this. I just think we will find something wrong with quantum mechanics, all this kind of theory stuff will go out of the window. And then there are things like, for example, in Gödel's theorem, I always wonder, in practice, how relevant is it? Because suppose you have this one statement that you can't prove to be true. What will you do as a physicist? Well, you would go and see if it's true by making a measurement.
Yeah.
You can make a measurement. Like if you can't measure it, you can. So if you can measure it, you check it. So if it's true, you add this as another action, right? So this is how it works. I have to say that I think most physicists won't be terribly impressed by the paper, but I quite like.
Well, I have, even though I'm one of the authors, I also have mixed feelings. But I partly, again, it was my confirmation bias. I go back to 1984, when I was old and you were a baby, when string theory was not called string theory. It's called the theory of everything by absolutely every practitioner who's working on it. And in fact, even if it were a theory of everything, it would actually be a theory of very little, as Frank Joseph used to say, because, you know, quantum gravity is incredibly important for understanding the beginning of the universe and the ends of black holes, but not for understanding how water boils or oatmeal boils or any of it, you know, most of the things, or how to build better materials, many of the things that matter in people's lives. But I did like, I do like various aspects of this, because I'd like to hear people stop using the term theory of everything. But the idea is that if the way I think of a theory of everything, if you had it, is that you have a theory that can allow you to calculate in advance anything you could see. Calculate in advance and predict any measurement you could ever do. That would be a complete theory. There's nothing that one could ever see or do that this theory would not allow you to predict. That's kind of, and on any scale in the universe. And there are fundamental, as you point out, mathematical arguments that are quite profound in some cases, that basically say that's impossible. And I think that's really interesting. As you say, I give your point about Gödel is very correct. There are some things that are true that you can't prove to be true. It's also it's more explicit in Tarski's theorem. There's three theorems: Gödel, Tarski, and Chaitin's that we talk about. But they all are different aspects of incompleteness. And then physicists would add that as an activity. And all we're saying is, yes, it would be, we call that a meta theory. So you can't algorithmically start from a certain set of rules and derive everything. You basically, there's some things you couldn't derive, and then you want to add them. And there may be an infinite number of things you have to add, who knows. But, and so that's interesting in a general, maybe, I hate to use the word philosophical sense, but in a general sense for the limiting the claims that science will ever be over in that sense. Now, you may argue that the direction science is going in isn't important anyway, but I like to think of it as cosmic job security. That there'll never be a theory that allows you to predict everything. You'll have to do more experiments and discover, but you'll have to keep looking. And you know, thinking alone won't do it. You'll have to keep looking, and that's great, because science at its best involves looking and discovering things about the world. And the thing I like about that last part of this incompleteness is that, and because it does relate to a lot of the claims of quantum gravity, and there's so many claims and so much hyperbole, as you know, about string theory and loop quantum gravity and all of the rest. But one of the aspects that's relevant to black holes is thermalization. And one of the interesting things that I actually hadn't realized until we were working on this paper, and I didn't know enough about it, but the process of thermalization has been shown to basically be undecidable. In a fundamental mathematical way, when a system will thermalize, is kind of like the same as knowing when this computer program will shut itself off, and you can't, and that depends upon the complexity that you don't know in advance. You don't know how much complexity you have to understand, and whether that was the argument you gave at the end. And so it does relate in a, to me at least, in a real way to some of the directions that people are going in quantum gravity, which is that if thermalization in the neighborhood of black hole, event horizons, and all of that is important, this may actually come back and bite you in the face, that the theory may not be able to actually tell you something you're claiming happens, that you may not actually be able to ever really fundamentally calculate from first principles. So it may have a practical significance, it may not, but you're absolutely right. It's like everything related to the theory of everything, when it comes to something, it probably doesn't matter very much. As Frank used to say, I don't want a theory of everything, I want a theory of something. And theories of something are particularly useful. Theories of everything are fun for some people to talk about. And like you, it was fun for me to come up with, to write something and basically argue that even if you like it, it can't happen. Anyway, I don't know if we illuminated anything. Any comments based on what I said or no?
No, just a question. The paper that you mentioned about the thermalization, was this the recent Qubit paper, or?
No. There's another
No,
paper.
it's
It's
a
about
different
undecidability theorems.
All right,
They're
interesting.
applying-
Maybe you can send me a reference, because I must.
Yeah,
have
I'll send
missed
you a
that.
reference, because I
okay.
didn't know about this field enough and my colleagues did, and I learned about it and we reference it in in
Yeah, I
some
see.
point in our paper.
Well, I've looked at all these papers where they claim there's a physical quantity that we can't compute, it's always the same. And in all the papers that I've seen, is that some physical quantity becomes infinite, like it's an infinite number of particles or something like
Yeah.
that. So it's not actually a real system. So far, this has always been the case, which is why I want to look at this paper.
Okay, well, it'd be worthwhile looking at this one together. I have to say, I've written some papers of mine, some of which have had a great impact, which I didn't understand at the time I wrote them, and fully. And this one is one that I've had to come to grips with a lot. I'm not sure I even still fully understand it. I'm not sure this one is going to have the same kind of impact of some of the other ones, but it was fun to learn some of these things because I tend to ignore.
Greetings.
I mean, Gödel and these incompleteness theorems are very important, but because, as you say, from a practical perspective, I'm someone who likes to just do things, and it often seems a little ephemeral. So I haven't thought about them in detail, and this forced me at least to think about them in detail a little bit. Okay, anyway, thank you for the advertisement, and I appreciate it.
Well, a lot of people asked me to discuss this, so yeah.
Well, I've now learned if you put theory of everything in a paper, everyone, all these people in the public want to hear about it. But anyway, now I will talk about something that's much more grounded, perhaps the most grounded calculation in elementary particle physics, the thing that made quantum field theory put it on the map. One of the two calculations is something called the G-2, in this case G-2 of the muon, the magnetic moment of the muon. Elementary particles are charged and they behave like they're spinning. And a spinning charge will have a magnetic moment. Now, they're not really spinning, but quantum mechanics says they behave like they're spinning and they have a magnetic moment. And because they have their charge, which is quantized, and their spin, which is quantized, you can get a number for the value in terms of some fundamental unit called the Bohr magneton of the magnetic moment of elementary particles. And if all things were just simple, the number would be 2 in those units, or a half, or depending what unit you pick. But of course, the great thing about quantum field theory is it says that there are actually all sorts of virtual processes going on where a muon isn't just a muon, it's emitting a photon, and then for a while it's 2 muons and a muon and an anti-muon. And on small scales, lots of strange things are happening. Virtual processes that make the vacuum of elementary particle physics strange. And many people say, well, that can't be true. But of course, the real beauty in the 1947, 48, 49 was you could actually make prediction. You could actually calculate results in spite of all the craziness that's going on at small scales and make predictions of what the quantum mechanical corrections are to this number 2. And it is the best prediction in all of science, in the sense that from fundamental principles, you can make a prediction of a number to almost 12 decimal places. And the other amazing thing, which I think is even more amazing, as a theorist in particular, is that experimentalists can measure certain quantities, if they're really clever, to 12 decimal places. And there's nowhere else in science where a fundamental prediction that's all the way to 12 decimal places can be compared to theory to 12 decimal places from fundamental principles. It's really, in my mind, one of the most beautiful things in physics, that you can actually make a fundamental prediction and test it. And it really tells us that empty space is really weird. And so the G-2 of the muon is incredibly important because it validated the whole computational scheme we use to try and understand elementary particles and fields. But what makes it even more interesting, and what's made it more interesting for 40 years, is because the quantum corrections are sensitive to weird processes. If there's any new physics, like supersymmetry, which has new elementary particles which can be emitted by muons and then absorbed at very small levels, giving very small effects. But if you can measure something to 12 decimal places, maybe you can look at those effects. In fact, many people have argued, why build a big accelerator when you can look for effects that come in at the part per billion level in a very sensitive experiment, and then do the experiment. It's not a tabletop experiment. These are big, many meter long storage rings of muons, but it's still less expensive than building a new particle collider. And so people have argued, hey, maybe this is a great place for new physics. In fact, I've forgotten this till just now, but I actually wrote a paper that's sort of significant on one of the first calculations of the G-2 of the muon and supersymmetry theories. I totally forgot that. But anyway, so it's incredibly interesting. Now, what made it more interesting, at least from a fundamental perspective, is it looked like there was a difference between the theoretical prediction and the observations in the 12th or in the 10th or 11th or 12th decimal place. And if it wasn't so beautiful, you'd say, who cares at the 10th, 11th, 12th decimal place? How am I going to believe something like that? But you can. If there was a known, well-defined disagreement statistically between the theory and the observation of 12 decimal places, it would tell us there's something new. And supersymmetry predicted such a difference. And for a while, it looked like there was such a difference. And people have been doing these G-2 experiments, colleagues of mine back when I was at Yale, their whole careers, and they're beautiful. They really are beautiful and very clever experiments. You basically, the idea is basically, if you have a magnetic moment and you have a magnetic field, then a little magnet will precess.
A straightforward mission
And the frequency of its precession will depend upon how big a magnet it is. That's the basic simple idea. And so they take muons and store them and see how they precess in magnetic fields and look at the radiation they emit, more or less, and it's like NMR. It's very precise and allows you to do unbelievably good experiments. And the most recent, and people say final G-2 experiment was just done at Fermilab. I think the magnet was taken from, you need large magnets for this. It was taken from Brookhaven National Laboratory, another accelerator in the United States, to Fermilab, and built, and it stored 300 billion muons. Remember, muons only live 1 second long, but if you accelerate them enough, they live a little longer. And so it's hard to store them, and there's 300 billion of them in this big magnetic field. And they finally measured the answer is, and the correction to this number 2 is and I have to say it because they worked so hard to get the number, 0.001165920705. And that's known with an accuracy of 127 parts per billion. The prediction is 0.001165920033 with a theoretical uncertainty of 540 parts in the last 3 numbers. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it agrees, the theory and the experiment agree. Now, having said that, there's one little additional technicality which is kind of neat, which is, how do you calculate? What's the uncertainty in the theory? How dare you say theory has an uncertainty? Well, the uncertainty comes in the fact that muons, which are only experience the weak force and the electromagnetic force, nevertheless can emit quarks, which experience the strong force, and we can't calculate with the strong force. So we have to make approximations. And for a long time, people made approximations based on measurements, and they kept giving the wrong answer. And what's really fascinating is, well, one way to calculate is put it on a computer with a lattice and make space a lattice, and then let the computer do detailed calculations on a lattice. And it turns out those lattice calculations give answers that are different than the other calculations and agree with the observations. And initially that was a big deal and people didn't believe the lattice calculations, but now more people have done them. And now it looks like the computers are smarter than we are in that sense, or at least they're giving an answer that's in agreement with the observations. And why extrapolating results from other data from other experiments gives the wrong answer is not yet known. But the bottom line is, at the end of all of this amazing bit of work, and real solid work by theorists and solid work by experiments, we've made the best measurement that's ever been made, and the theory agrees. And many people are disappointed, of course, because there's no evidence for supersymmetry or anything else that people thought might come out of it. But even though it gives a null result, I wanted to herald it because I think it's in some ways science at its best. Turning it over to you.
Well, that was a very nice speech. So I'm kind of super unsurprised by this because one could see this coming for like 10 years or something. And I think there's a deeper lesson in this, which is that you said some people have argued you could replace to some extent building bigger colliders with making high precision measurements of lower energies. And this is the sort of problem that you run into, because you'll have to do these calculations very, very precisely. So you put the burden on the theory.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to higher energies, if there is a signal, it tends to be in your face.
Yeah.
Once you have collected enough data, you have a bomb. That's it.
Yeah, good point.
Basically. So it's a somewhat cleaner signature. But yeah, I mean, it's a great achievement. I can remember people discussing the muon anomaly since I've been in physics. And so I'm quite happy we can lay it to rest. Though I have to say that, you only showed like the good side. So I think it also has like a negative side, which is that, from the people that I've personally known and talked to, I think no one actually believed it was some physics beyond the standard model stuff. Like everyone, maybe that's a generational thing, like put the blame on the theoretical calculation, or maybe it's something to do with the kind of people that I tend to know. But the idea that it's kind of a new particle, it's a good force, or it's extra dimensions, and I have a student who wrote a paper on that, on which I'm a co-author, so I'm also that attracts much more attention, like in the headlines. So when a newspaper writes about wrote about the T-2 anomaly, they write something about evidence for a fifth force or something like that. The standard model is broken, stuff like that. And that attracts a lot of attention, not just in the general population, but also among physicists. And I think it inspires them to make up more stuff until it becomes this self-running thing. And so I think that there's this community dynamics, which is something that I really don't like. So I'm quite happy that we can finally put this to rest.
Well, I don't know what I warn you, nothing ever gets put to rest finally. But anyway, but look, I'm sympathetic with you there. But look, I'm telling you, I'm of a generation where I attended many meetings where a certain group of people would say, this proves supersymmetry, this anomaly in G-2. Here's our calculation, look at the anomaly, it proves that supersymmetry is true. And I'd hear it over and over again. I didn't believe it. But and so it has been useful to close certain doors. But I'll also say you're right. But you come from a generation of people saying, "Oh, it's an anomaly. Let me invent some crap, some nonsense crap," and that's true. But let me play the other side of the devil's advocate. When I did this was in 1985, 84, 85. We did the calculation of G-2 in supersymmetric theories. And it was what I liked. It was one of the. I liked it because it was most honest and certainly difficult. It was the most complicated calculation I'd ever done, and probably have ever done. And I did it with people. I could never have done it alone. I did it with a colleague, Noriska Sakai, and others. But he's a Japanese physicist, and required keeping so many terms that I couldn't even write them neatly on a piece of paper. But he would store them. But what I loved about it was a concrete theory. Low energy supersymmetry was a concrete theory. If you wanted it to explain data, it was highly constrained in certain ways. And therefore, if you worked hard enough, you could make a concrete prediction. And it was, for me, that's the most satisfying. That was an extremely satisfying thing, was to take a concrete theory, which was beyond the standard model at the time, and make a concrete prediction. It just required a lot of work. And so for me, I think I was trying to convince my colleagues that I could be an honest, hardworking theoretical physicist. I had a number of colleagues like Joe Polchinski and Mark Wise at the time at Harvard, and who basically said, you gotta prove yourself by doing this calculation. So anyway, I think it's nice in an era where science allowed you to make concrete predictions, even for well-motivated new physics, and then compare them to theory. The problem is what's happened is things have become so difficult, and the standard model is so good that people now are of a generation, and your generation, I think, that tend to say, oh, let me just invent the wildest things in the world to explain everything with no constraints on parameters, and every new result can be new dimensions or this or that. And yeah, I have the same kind of feeling about all of that, which is that it's much ado about nothing. I don't know if I'm over stressing, but so anyway, I think G-2 is an example of, maybe we can put it this way: G-2 is an example of physics at its best, and maybe physics at its worst. But it's wonderful when good theories can be tested with good experiments, and one hopes that's true in all areas of science. Maybe we can end on a positive note. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, let's talk about the future. I want to talk about AI, and maybe more generally, want to hear what your sense is what AI is going to do to physics. So in the past months, there have been several developments with self-improving AIs. Maybe the biggest headline was came from Google DeepMind, AlphaEvolve.
Yes.
It's basically an artificial intelligence system that mutates code and then tests the code and improves it. So I was quite impressed by how successful it was at improving the code, and also that it made some actually useful discoveries. Like, one of the things that they found was a better way to multiply big matrices. Basically, that's more efficient than anything that was previously known. So no humans can come up with it so far. And this thing kind of did it within, I don't know, a couple of days, or God knows. I didn't look exactly at the numbers, because we can quibble about, do we actually count the time that they put into to construct the thing or something like that. But it doesn't really matter. So it found something really new. And it's quite interesting, because matrix multiplication is one of the operations that you need to do in a lot of those models, right? So it, in some sense, it did improve itself. Or at least other AIs. And so this is one of the steps towards what's been called the intelligence explosion, formerly known as the singularity, when AIs can improve themselves, so it becomes this self-running exponential process of which we don't know the endpoint, hence the singularity. So I'm not saying that we're anywhere close to that point, but what we're seeing right now is that people are trying to use these evolutionary approaches to do exactly that. And of course, that isn't a new idea, but it's kind of like this idea of the neural networks, also isn't really a new idea. So in the end, I think what was the inflection point for making this work was just computing power. Okay, so I'm greatly oversimplifying, and everyone who works on the topic will hate me for saying this, because of course there have been many, improvements on the code and insights, blah 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 blah. But basically, what's driving the whole thing is computing power, and that more people can use it. And if more people can use it, they can work with it. They have more insights. And so naturally, like, this makes me wonder, like, what's it going to do to science? So one thing that we're already seeing right now is that these models are becoming really, like, not large language models, but some of the stuff that DeepMind's working on, and actually also some of the large language models like O3, like GPT-O3, they're becoming
Page
really
94.
good at math. And so I think some mathematicians are actually spooked by this. They're